Well, hi. It really is a wonderful opportunity when I get to come home to this place that nourished me, that inspired me, that moved me on in my life in ways that I hadn't imagined. So thank you for coming out today. Last fall, I took an opportunity to go on a 3-day solo silent retreat at a Jesuit monastery near Reading, Pennsylvania. It's 240 acres of rolling hills, and I mentioned that because out in Iowa, 240 acres is barely a hobby farm. But out there's a lot more density, and having that much space is sort of a luxury. The monastery offers fairly spare accommodations, as you can well imagine, a room with just a single bed and a desk, a shared bathroom down the hall. The monastery itself is this gorgeous building, of course, that probably could hold 350 people. Unfortunately, there's only about a dozen monks left, and they're all in their 70s or older. So I'm not sure how long the monastery will exist. Nonetheless, they allow us people to come and do these silent retreats on their own, and so I went. I arrived on a Tuesday and was to leave sometime in the afternoon, late afternoon on Thursday. So more or less 3 days and 2 nights of solitude where I would not be disturbed by anyone, and at the same time graciously cared for. Meals were provided. There's a spare staff if I needed anything. I intentionally kept all the electronics disconnected, which was as terrifying as you can imagine. In other words, an intentional solitude where I could be left only with my own thoughts, my own self, in silence for 3 days. Now, I have to admit, I'm an introvert, so being that my energy is generally replenished not in crowds of people, but in quiet moments alone, this retreat seemed like something that would just be exactly what I needed, something really good for my spirit. And it was, to a point. So the afternoon I arrived, it was really amazing. It was wonderful, and I wandered the monastery and its beautiful chapels, and the grounds were just gorgeous, and it was late October, and the trees were all on fire with their beauty. I found lovely places to sit in the cloisters, and I could read. I never get any chance just to sit and read anymore. That evening, I had a simple supper of soup and bread. I went to bed early, slept really well, and rose with the sun. Followed that with a simple breakfast. I walked the grounds again. I read. I spent some time in meditation. I read. And after dinner that night, as I had finished the second book I had brought with me, I found myself bored, really, really bored. And as I was preparing for bed that evening and I was thinking about the next day, I was facing this next day and I was wondering what in the world was I going to do with it. Another day in solitude, suddenly for this introvert heart, was becoming a rather frightening thought. So, I rose the next morning with the sun, packed up my stuff, and left. Ran out the door, hopped in my car, and drove home. And ever since then, I was left wondering why. Why this introvert ditched out of a 3rd day of blessed solitude. And I have an idea why. but I'll get to that later. I want to tell you about 3 stories. These 3 compelling scenes out of the Hebrew and Christian scriptures. These narratives that resonate deeply with me and with the way I see you and others moving through this world, through this life. And these scenes are, of course, embedded in the larger narratives of the scriptures, but I think they also stand alone as deep metaphors for moments in our lives. And here's the scenes. There are 3 of them. Jesus is at Gethsemane, Moses at the burning bush, and Jacob on the banks of the Jabbok. So the story of Jesus at Gethsemane is the story of Jesus' last night of freedom before he is arrested and ultimately killed. And the story is found in all 4 of the gospel accounts. And I mention that because it's significant. The gospel accounts, there's actually very few stories that are in all 4 of them. We sort of culturally have matched it all together as to one big story, but there are 4 distinctive narratives, and they don't share a whole lot. But this story they do. Gethsemane they do. So there was something even compelling to those 4 gospel writers that made this story important. So the story says that Jesus takes a few of his disciples to a garden called Gethsemane, which is an olive grove on the hillside in Jerusalem. Gethsemane, as it turns out, means oil press. So now you have something you can take away for today. How many knew that? Oil press. Not sure how you'll use that in your daily life, but there he goes. So Jesus leaves the disciples at the bottom of the hillside, goes up to pray, and the author of Mark tells it this way. He says it in 14:34, and he says, "And he said to them, I am deeply grieved, even to death. Remain here and keep awake." And then going a little further, he threw himself on the ground and prayed that if it were possible that the hour might pass from him. He said, "Abba, Father, for you all things are possible. Remove this cup from me. Yet not what I want, but what you want." So Jesus knows what's coming, right? And this is important. I don't think there's anything supernatural about him knowing what's coming. Jesus is nothing if not deeply attentive to life, not only what is possible, but what is. And what is in this moment in his story is a case of a guy who's been gathering a pretty big following of people, who's been preaching and teaching against the oppressive forces of empire, of Rome, and against the forces of indifferent religious dogma and status quo of the temple authorities. And now he's walked into the center of all of that power in Israel, both Rome, the Roman oppressors, and the temple authorities, all centered right there in Jerusalem, and he just walked right in. So it's no great feat of foresight for Jesus to think and to know that he's in deep trouble. We'll go with trouble. That there are likely and often severe consequences to speaking truth to oppressors, to speaking truth to indifference, to speaking truth to power, and of course, he's afraid. Naturally afraid, humanly afraid. So he goes off into solitude to pray to God, to beg for his life, to ask that if it is at all possible to somehow change the seemingly inevitable consequences of his work and ministry. And friends, I think this story resonates so deeply with me because I've been there. Not perhaps facing down quite the same consequences as Jesus was, but still, there have been times in my life when I was so deeply afraid that I prayed for my life, prayed for the lives of others whom I loved, prayed that I need not suffer the repercussions of the choices that I've made. And I don't know anyone I don't know anyone who hasn't been there on Gethsemane at one time or another in their lives. Alone, with your life, afraid of what's next, pleading for release. And then there's Moses. In Exodus 3, the narrative has Moses tending the flock of his father-in-law, and he goes out beyond the wilderness, alone, save for the sheep, and he finds himself on a mountain called Horeb, and he's just walking along there and comes upon a bush that appears to be burning. There's flames and heat and smoke and light, but the bush was not being consumed by fire, which caught his attention. I hope it would catch yours. But the bush on fire, but not really on fire, was not actually the weirdest thing happening on the mountain that afternoon. Because after you're looking at the bush that's on fire and not really on fire, a voice starts coming to you, and it's the voice of God. Now you got to imagine yourself as Moses, alone, out beyond the wilderness, just walking along, tending your flock of sheep, no one around for miles, and you've been alone like this, not for 3 days, but weeks. And suddenly you hear, plain as day, a voice calling to you, specifically you, Moses. Moses. And speaking for myself, I'm pretty sure that I wouldn't have answered that voice with, "Here I am," as Moses does. I have a feeling that I would have turned tail and run off that mountain as fast as I could, and then maybe I would have remembered to bring the sheep. But Moses doesn't do that, does he? Instead, he enters into a conversation with God, and God is telling him to do all this crazy stuff, right? Go to Egypt. Go to the Pharaoh and tell him to release all the Israelite slaves. Just go do that. God tells Moses that he is then to lead all those slaves, all the Israelites, out of Egypt and into their freedom, into the land of milk and honey. And Moses, on his part, God love him, ain't buying it. So he begins to question God. Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh? What if the Israelites ask me who sent me? What if they think I'm crazy? Which is not an unreasonable question, given that you're in the afternoon having a conversation with a talking, burning bush that's not really burning. And then Moses continues, I'm not an eloquent speaker. He says, he calls himself low of speech and slow of tongue. How am I supposed to know? How am I supposed to know what to say to Pharaoh, to the Israelites, to anyone? And by the way, it's this point in the story where I have to be impressed with God's patience, because if it were me, I'd be grabbing the man and going, Moses, would you just do what I'm telling you, for God's sakes? But then I remember that's probably more me just trying to get a kid to wear a coat. In any case, Moses says, finally, please, send someone else. Send someone else. And this story, again, resonates with me because I've been there too. Arguing against a call to be something that I am not. Trying to figure out the loophole, the escape from that which holds me to a greater life and allows me to stay in my comfort zone, allows me to stay small, safe, and secure. And I don't think I know anyone who hasn't been there on Horeb, on the mountain, hearing the voice that calls us to an unimagined possibility, standing there arguing that we're not the ones. We're not the ones to speak truth to power. We are not able to do that. Coming up with 100 reasons why we can't, why we shouldn't follow that call, standing there alone with our lives and afraid of what's next. Pleading again, send someone else. So 10 years ago, when I was wandering around this beautiful building, if you were to ask me what my favorite verse of the Bible was, I would have rolled my eyes and said, I don't know. Who reads that? However, today I do have a favorite verse. It's Genesis 32:24. And Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. So in that story, we have Jacob, who has left the indentured servitude of his uncle Laban after close to a couple of decades of service. And Jacob takes his 4 wives, Rachel, Leah, Bilhah, and Zilpah. And I mention their names because, man, do we not mention the women's names very often. He had 4 wives. Had 12 sons, 1 daughter, Dinah, plus his own servant families, a host of goats and sheep, and all the household tents and goods, and heads out to his father Isaac's homeland. And when this caravan gets to the Jabbok River, Jacob sends the lot of them across. But you got to imagine, this isn't just a simple, hey, go across the river. You got 4 wives, 12 sons, a daughter, all the sheep, goats, animals, servants, their families, all the household goods. It's a lot of stuff. It takes a while. So evening falls, and Jacob is still on one side of the river, and everything, his whole life is now crossed the river. And so there he was, alone, and it's in that moment that Jacob gets in this wrestling match that goes on all night long. And if you investigate the literature, there is so much speculation as to who or what Jacob was wrestling that night. The translation I used here says a man. Others say an angel or a spirit or something similarly otherworldly. Near the end of the story, the text indicates somewhat that Jacob concludes his opponent was God. I don't know. And truly, I think such speculation misses the point, the beauty of this particular metaphor. You see, Jacob's attacker doesn't win. Jacob refuses to let him go. And his opponent dislocates Jacob's hip. But Jacob persists and demands a blessing. And his opponent says, "You shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with humans and have prevailed." Israel is this word that means one who strives with God, or God striver. That's the other thing you can know. Gethsemane and Israel. And this story of Jacob resonates because I am there too. So often, I'm there on the banks of the Jabbok alone and wrestling with God, wrestling with the spirit of this life, wrestling with the universe, wrestling with myself, my heart, my courage, striving, begging for my blessing. And I don't think I know anyone who isn't or hasn't been on the banks of the Jabbok in the dark nights of the soul, fighting for their lives, fighting for their blessing, alone with our lives, afraid of what's next, simply asking to be blessed. So there they are. 3 ancient stories, 3 ancient characters, 3 people wrestling with God, fighting with God, pleading with God. And what strikes me in these stories is that in each case, they are alone. They are in their solitude, because it is in our solitude, friends. It is in our solitude that we end up facing our deepest fears, our grief, our sorrows, our suffering, our pain. In our solitude, we have nothing to distract us, nowhere to hide. In our solitude, we are confronted with the one person we can't escape from, the one that won't let us off, the one who knows both our darkness and our light. In other words, the one person we fear to face in our stripped down, vulnerable, and uncertain true life. The one that we fear, perhaps above all else, ourselves. So I think that's why I left my retreat early. I wasn't ready. I wasn't willing. Somehow I knew that in my solitude I would end up wrestling in the dark, striving with God and man, and I wasn't sure that I could persist, that I could prevail. So I packed up and said, send someone else. But in so doing, I missed my chance for the blessing. I missed the chance to be transformed. I ditched my courage, my wholeheartedness, and dove back into my apparent comfort and security. I played it safe, and nothing changed. Friends, I don't need to stand here and remind you that we are in a time of great uncertainty, upheaval in our political and cultural lives. I hear our fears. I share our anxieties. I have felt our collective sorrow, and I worry right alongside each and every one of you. And I believe in the power of hope, not some sort of airy-fairy, sometimes it'll turn out all right, but an active hope of story and compassion and empathy and love. I know that the bonds of family and community that call us to be greater than ourselves alone. I know that you and I are called to a different way of being in this world, called to wonder and imagination, called to change ourselves, to grow ourselves into wholeness, into possibility, and into love. But for us to answer that call, for us to speak our deepest values, our deepest truths into power, we have to be courageous. And my friends at the UU Society Mill Creek that hear me preach most weeks know I preach a lot about courage. I preach about the courage which is a sort of a heart space, a full-heartedness, an open-heartedness. But this open-hearted courage, this vulnerable and messy courage that allows us to confront our fears, this courage allows us to confront our fears, those that are imposed on us and those we impose on others. It also allows us to confront our suffering, that which is imposed on us and that which we impose on others. And it allows us to confront our oppressions, those that are imposed upon us and those that we impose on others. And confront our shame, that which is imposed on us, and that shame that we impose on others, our courage, our open-heartedness, our messy vulnerability is what it takes to confront our shame, our oppression, our suffering, our fears. So if I could give you anything today and in your days to come, it would be that. It'd be courage. Courage to step into your solitude. Courage to enter into your soul fights, to wrestle with them through the long nights and to persist despite the warnings, despite the explanations, to persist until we get our blessing, until we are transformed, until we are so changed that we require a new name. Amen. And I love you, and may you live in blessing.